I'd just like to hear something from them that tells me that they know what they're doing. So that's the macro story. Now, we'll talk about the micro story here, because the thing about the micro story is relationship, again, if we think about the relationship between journalist and leader, most journalists now are craving a leader that has spent a bit of time on a topic and then comes back and talks to us when they're ready. We are craving that particular leadership. Now, we won't get it anytime soon because we want them to turn up every day. So we don't know how to reward good behaviour or give them the opportunity to make a mistake on our behalf, because one mistake now and you're out. Now, this is where this digital age is quite problematic for people. The only thing that resonates in the digital age today is a number. It's not the words in your policy brief. It is the number, up, down, news poll, essential media, the Nielsen poll. What we've seen in the last 10 years is politics and the media moving to a particular point where they're actually defaulting to the easiest thing they can do, which is to just check the number. And if the number says the government's in trouble, you don't care what it is they've just said this week, because it says they're in trouble. If they come up with a good idea, the number says no one paid attention that week, you say, well, it has to have been a bad idea. Now, it was never this way in the past because we didn't have this continuous polling. Now, one thing we probably do need to see is probably a bit of creative destruction on both sides. Well, both sides get to experience the thing that Kevin Rudd experienced, a 20-point lead in the poll and then a 15-point collapse leading to, whether it was a nervous breakdown or not, I can't say. But if both sides get to experience this, maybe they'll be able to think through the polls. But it's going to be pretty awful living through it for the next few years, because there may be a bit more of this to come. Now, I'll just take it back a step. If you think about what's happening to government today, and this government is obviously Australia's unique in a sense because it doesn't have the sovereign debt issue, and we're not ageing as fast as Europe is, for example. I'd hate to be doing public policy in Europe or Japan at the moment. I'd worry about the partisanship in the US, but you'd still think that there's still a bit of life in that settlement, in that country, that is, not necessarily in their political system. But what you've got here, and this is going to happen to us sooner or later, the price signal sent from the real world is, A, people don't want to give anything up. B, you can't afford to run the government in a longer term sense, you know, on the prices and you're running them now. Your revenues are never going to be able to keep up with community expectation. So, and this is where the feedback from the electorate's quite important. You don't want to reimagine government every other day, because every time you try and reimagine government, you end up realising you've just had a thought that somebody had 10 years ago. They tried it then, it worked for a few years, and then it disappeared. But you do need to work out the things that government has to do. And I know this sounds obvious, but there's a lot of work going around government now, partly influenced by this sort of Blair, Howard, Rudd paradigm, which is, I want lots of paper, I want to be able to control everything from my office. So one thing that technology is doing, by the way, it's putting both the journalist, the politician, the public servant and the voter in a position where they're almost equal in terms of their access to information. That means the person who can interpret the information sooner or later is going to win. But they can't win if they want to recontrol all the information. And this is if you get a chance to talk to any minister in the next few weeks, months or years, tell them to let it all out. To stop this thing that's been occurring, and this predates obviously this generation of politicians. It started as long ago as Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser. Tell them to forget this idea that you can contain it to the office. Tell them to forget the idea that a public servant is not allowed to talk to a journalist. Up until 1995 and 1996, if you were in the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery, you got to talk to bureaucrats on background because they could trust you and you could trust them. And the minister could trust them because they knew more than the minister did. Of course, what's happened in the last few years is there are these media units and there are these policy advisors who view the bureaucracy essentially as an extension of the minister's office, which it never was. Now, of course, two biggest examples out of the last government is building the education revolution and the home insulation program. Both of them would have passed the first head nod of an opinion poll when they were scoped, when they were announced. Then, of course, what happens once you implement it? And this comes back to what media does today, and this is a destructive thing the media does today. For whatever reason, the media decides in its coverage of the rollout of this thing that any mistake equals failure of the program. So you don't have anything that can benchmark This is as a reader or as a citizen. If you say that there's cost overrun in 5, 10 or 20% of the projects, apparently that's the end of the world. Now unfortunately, this is the thing that a lot of governments are going to have to work out sooner or later. They can't control that level of coverage unless they reset expectations. That the role of government, the job of government, is a continuous trial and error process. And this is why I think, as we watch the information revolution play out, this is why I think you need to work out what it is that only you can do. Some of the other stuff, I think, for good or for ill, you're going to have to let go, because it's just going to be too expensive to continue to run these shadow operations, generating 7,500 pieces of paper out of PM&C every year. And we know it doesn't work because it didn't save John Howard and it didn't save Kevin Rudd. I'll leave it on that thought. One of the reasons why I wanted to throw open to questions is I expected some News Limited related questions. I'll just say this one thing. The most interesting thing to me in the British story at the moment, we can talk more detail if somebody wants to take a question, wants to take on the issue. The interesting thing with this story at the moment is that politics is pushing back for the first time against, obviously, an organisation, but it's actually pushing back against the idea of media power. It's not pushing back against the idea of media power just because it wants to, but because finally it's got consent from the population to do it. Now, there are very specific circumstances that have led to this story. Obviously, what idiot hacks the phone of a girl missing and then deletes a couple of messages? I mean, that is just beyond comprehension, actually, and why anyone would think that anybody higher up the food chain would have ever authorised that behaviour. But put that to one side. What politics in the UK have worked out, and I suspect it's the specific example of the hung parliament that has generated this level of bravery. I think David Cameron looks across the chamber and he sees Ed Miliband going Rupert Murdoch. He sees the guy sitting next to him, Deputy Prime Minister, who's sort of looking across at Ed Miliband going, "You asked me to walk across?" And at that point, Rupert Murdoch is collateral damage. That's really what's happened in that system. The specifics of the hacking are very important. That's obviously what's given the public the consent. But sooner or later, something like this was going to happen, if you think about it thematically. Sooner or later, politics was going to push back. Now, the thing for politics, the next step is the next time they open their mouth, the media want to be able to respect what's coming out of a leader's mouth. Now, they're not going to be able to respect what comes out of a leader's mouth if a leader is going to continue down the path that we've been the last few years. So I think it's a very interesting time. That's one of the reasons why I'm very interested in that story over there. You can't see a parallel here, but we've got a hung parliament here too, so you're going to end up with a media inquiry, whether you want one or not. So this is that's a preemptive comment on News Limited's travails. News International's travails. Alan, if I could get you to field the questions for me. Thank you. I threw the script away. Yes.
So if you take the Menzies period, you get Holt, you get Gordon, you get McMahon.
Yep.
So, and then after the whole Keating period, you get and Howard, you get Rudd and then Gillard. So who's the McMahon?
Out of Rudd or Gillard, you're asking, or are we about to get him? Yes, that's true. That's true. But again, you're describing the period that comes after a long boom. And then you've got a global income shock, which flips everybody out. Because I could have the advantage of having read up on this, the public policy reaction to the Korean War boom was roll gold. So the money is coming. Fadden says, "I'm going to hang on to it on your behalf to help you pay your tax bills next year when the price falls." At the end of the 60s into the early 70s, people didn't think that. They thought they could buy full employment. And so Whitlam gets a terms of trade shock. What did he do to government spending? Up 20% one year, up 30% the next year? Crazy stuff. We've seen a variation of this. It's harder to add the thing up because national income keeps rising. But coming off the back of Howard, we are seeing a particular form of instability, but we're seeing a particular form of instability that is not yet related to The other instability you get in a national system, which is recession. So it's not related to that. It's actually related to many years of do-nothing government, and this is where I'd put the second phase of the Howard government in. And the generation of politicians that come through on those terms, Tony Abbott 1994, that's his intake, Mark Latham's intake as well. These are post-recession intakes, by the way. Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd 1998, Malcolm Turnbull 2004. Now, they turn up, the first thing they wanted to do, which presumably was the first thing that generation after Menzies wanted to do, late 60s, early 70s, was the intrigue, was just about the game. This group have had a slightly different thing as well, because they've been born in a particular media environment where they think, I understand the media, this is how I'm going to govern. That hasn't worked out either. But I think you're right. This is not the first time we've seen it. The complication now is technology, definitely. But then again, I wasn't living it then, but presumably television was the complication then, which changed the tone of political debate until people adjusted.
Rolf, from the OECD.
George, fantastic ideas about, for someone who is not Australian, sounds like a very interesting story.
Thank you.
Well, let me say, didn't you, in your equation, didn't you miss one? And that's the guy who runs his little blog somewhere, has a very nice idea, gets about 1 million followers, and does something that neither you as the journalist nor the politician, clever as they all may be, you and them, they just run over you. Isn't that something?
Do they run over? It's an interesting question. Do they run over you? Like Alan mentioned that I've run a blog, which I trust nobody here reads. What actually happens with the internet, and this is, most journalists get this. If you put enough feelers out there, somebody's going to come back to you with information you don't have, which is not a bad research tool, primary research tool for a journalist. Now, if some other blogger can get 1 million hits on a particular thing, it's not going to cost me my job. I'm relieved that somebody else has had that thought, and I'll have a look at it. That's my attitude to it. In a political sphere, it's different, of course. Like, I think we're a lot more open to it in the media, even though we would like to maintain our newspapers as we'd grown up with and all that. I wouldn't worry about that so much, but that's our instinctive reaction. But in politics, the idea that somebody else has an idea that you can't control, that's what freaks politicians out. I think the media, look, journalists of a certain age are intimidated by this, but I don't think journalists generally are intimidated by it, because, as I say, the idea that somebody out there knows something I don't is intriguing to me. And it should be intriguing to me, because that's my job, to find out what I don't know.
Jerry Stoker.
George, I'm Jerry Stoker. I'm from the United Kingdom, so obviously, as soon as you mentioned Murdoch, I thought I ought to say something. I suppose, in a way, the story is quite complicated, because it's not just the way that the political class reacted, but also we should recognise the role that other parts of the media, particularly The Guardian, played in bringing the story to its point of insight and knowledge that we currently have, which is an extraordinary story in itself. But I suppose what I wanted to ask, because you keep on talking about how politicians need to react, but actually I would have thought the vast majority of British citizens is saying, actually, maybe the media needs to change.
Yeah,
and what is the responsibility of people like you to change the way that the media actually covers politics and makes a contribution to our democracy?
We've been having a version of this debate because we've almost got dueling titles. The quarterly essay put out last year talks about politicians. Lindsay Tanner, an ex-politician, former finance minister in the Rudd government, wanted to blame the media. Now, at some point, not that anyone paid attention to mine, he gets a much better run as a former politician. The idea that the media is part of this problem, I accept. I've always accepted that. How do you fix it? I still err on the side of, when they behave like grown-ups, we can reward them, or we welcome it. And I know it's a difficult thing to say. It sounds, yes, but the alternative, and this is the difficult, I can tell you from a working journalist perspective, the alternative is to end up barracking and you don't want to barrack. Which party do I want to get over the line to bring back good government? Well, that's not my job. That's not how I see my job anyway. I am interested, when a political party, either of them, put out a good idea,